So there's a lot going on with the fallout of the Elden Ring DLC release. There are half who absolutely love it as a masterpiece, and there are the other half who review bombed the game for being too hard. That's an issue that I want to address with this video. Several other content creators already have addressed this issue, but I'm going to look at it from a different angle. This DLC is definitely not perfect in the slightest. After me talking about my arachnophobia being triggered in the Bloodborne boss ranking video, Miyazaki just had to put giant scorpions in the game, which more closely resemble spiders than scorpions. That being said, I still think this DLC is up there with The Old Hunters, Artorias of the Abyss, and The Ring City in terms of quality. Why do I think this? Well, let's delve into my thoughts. Spoiler warning for Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. I personally played it up to Mesmer, and still have a lot to go through. Part 1. Difficulty. Let's get the elephant in the room out of the way. The review bombing of the DLC for being too hard is stupid, immature, impulsive, and not helpful. If you're going to say it's too hard, give specific examples. When I fought Mesmer, for example, I had issues with a certain combo he did where I dodged perfectly and still got hit with his fire. That can be chalked down to a skill issue, as I was dodging away from the flames when I probably should have dodged into them, but still. Speaking of which, there have been some rather valid complaints about the vision getting obscured by the attacks. That's no exception with Mesmer, and apparently the final boss as well. But, with all that being said, Shadow of the Erdtree is not too hard. Let's bear this in mind. FromSoft have a very distinct pattern with their DLCs, and that is that they are a leap above the main game in terms of difficulty. This has been the case since the very first DLC in Dark Souls 1, so why is it all of a sudden a complaint now? The answer to that could be a variety of reasons. Reason 1, Elden Ring is the player's first ever Souls game. Reason 2, this is the first time the players experienced the DLC on the day of its release. Reason 3, they thought their OP build would make them fly through the DLC. There are other reasons, of course, but these are my observations. If we were to take an average of the difficulty of the main game bosses for any previous game in the series, it's guaranteed to be lower than the average difficulty of the DLC bosses. I know this because I spent the time doing it myself. I ranked each and every boss on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of difficulty, and I found that the DLC bosses were at least 2 points higher on average than the main game. That's a 20% increase in difficulty. Now, a lot of people could say, well, that's because of the early game bosses being easy. Alright, let's take our DLC bosses and compare them to the hardest bosses in the main game. Artorias of the Abyss. There are 4 bosses in this DLC: Sanctuary Guardian, Knight Artorias, Manus, and Calamite. Which main game bosses even compare to these 4? Ornstein and Smough? And that's about it. Like, you could say Gwyn without parrying, but that comes with an asterisk. You could say 4 Kings without Havel armor, but that also comes with an asterisk. What about DS2's DLCs? There are 9 bosses in the DLCs: Elana, Sin, Gank Squad, Fume Knight, Ceralon, Blue Smelter, Arva, Burnt Ivory King, and Ludden Zarlan. Who in the main game compares to these bosses? OG Smelter? Dark Lurker? Ancient Dragon? Throne Watcher and Defender? 4 of the 32 compare to the 9 out of 9 DLC bosses, and one of them is just because it's the same fight. DS3, the home of some of the best bosses in the series. We have Sister Frieda, Champion's Gravetender, Demon Prince, Medea, Half-Light, and Gale. Now, this is the closest any main game has come to the DLC in terms of difficulty. Nameless King, Twin Princes, Soul of Cinder, Pontiff, Champion Gundyr, and Dancer would be my 6 picks for the hardest main game bosses. Even then, I consider Medea, Frieda, Demon Prince, and Gale to only be comparable to Nameless King. The rest are easier. And the big one, Bloodborne. I saved Bloodborne for last because it's the most beloved DLC in From Software, and has the biggest jump in difficulty. Out of the 5 DLC bosses, 4 of them are very tough, and 3 are genuine contenders for the toughest in the whole series. Orphan, Ludwig, and Lawrence are the big 3. Lady Maria isn't too far behind. And there's Living Failures, the one people forget about, and so happens to be the easiest. Tell me, who are the big 3 of main game difficulty? Gehrman? Logarius? Abritus? They didn't even compare to Orphan, Ludwig or Lawrence. What about the next two hardest? Father Gascoigne and Shadows of Yharnam? Do you see what I'm getting at here? These DLCs have always been designed for late game difficulty, so it makes sense that for the Elden Ring DLC, they are on a similar level to the likes of Millennia, Malekith, Placidutax and Horaloo. Furthermore, you can make the game easier for yourself by collecting the Skadootree fragments and revered spirit ashes. They're littered across the map, and you can get up to level 4 on Skadootree fragments without facing a single boss. That's a 20% damage reduction right off the bat, if my math is correct. Not to mention a 20% increase in damage you deal to the enemies. Okay, hey, Chris from the future here. So it turns out that literally the day after I recorded this voiceover, From Software have released an update. And that update entails attack and damage negation curve scaling on the Skadootree blessing have been revised. The attack and damage negation has been increased for the first half of the maximum amount, and the second half will now be more gradual. The attack and damage negation granted by the final level of the blessing enhancement has been slightly increased. So basically, this means that the first half, aka levels 1 through 10 of the Skadootree blessing, have been increased in terms of damage and damage negation. This furthermore gives new players no excuse to say, oh, the Elden Ring DLC is too hard, because we've now got the first half dealing more damage and the second half dealing a little less damage, giving the leveling scaling a little bit of a bit more of a curve than a straight line like it was before. Whatever you think of this update, I think it's a slight improvement on the leveling system because, simply put, it means that it's just very similar to the original, where you level up, you do more damage the more you level up, but then there's a bit of a soft cap and it just slowly decreases in what it improves. So I just wanted to throw that in there while I was still able to edit this video. Thank you. Back to past Chris. Basically, to summarise, if a boss is too hard for you, do what you did in the main game when you faced Margit underleveled. Explore, get stronger, find new things to use. The game is telling you what to do without physically telling you what to do. FromSoft have done this since Dark Souls 1. If you hit a wall, go somewhere else. If you have nowhere else to go, learn to fight, find the openings and don't get greedy. This has been the bread and butter for a FromSoft game for the past 15 years. Part 2, the leveling system. With that massive rant out of the way, let's discuss the new leveling system. I don't like it. Maybe it will grow on me, but for now, I'm not a big fan. I've hated the leveling system in Sekiro since day one, and this is just a spin on the same idea. That being said, I do think the Elden Ring version is better than Sekiro's. At least you're not forced to kill mini bosses for more health, and at least you're not forced to kill the main bosses for more damage. Like, what's the point in having a leveling system that effectively gets cancelled out the moment you reach the next boss? Elden Ring fixes this issue by having a bunch of them accessible from the start. Like I said, you can get a 20% damage modifier before you fight a single boss, and you can get your spirit ashes to level 4 before fighting a boss as well. That may not seem like a lot, but consider that it's a 20% increase per strike. 5 hits basically grants you a 6th one for free. This increases the speed of the fight, giving you a better chance of winning. Despite this praise for the new system, I do think it should have been put into a different game. Elden Ring's leveling system was already perfect, because you get to choose how overpowered you want to be for the boss fight. This makes me think that From Software should have instead made it so that the DLC bosses were made for a specific level in the original system. Like, have the Dancing Lion be for level 160 players, or have Mesmer be a level 200 boss fight. That way, if people have issues with the DLC being too easy, then that's completely on them for leveling too high. The truth is, being a level 20 in the Skadootree system should have been the default level anyway, considering how much damage you give and receive with each attack. It also makes finding these fragments a pain without a guide, and who would want to use a guide for a first playthrough? It kinda takes away from the awe of it all. All in all, it was a good idea, and would have been much better suited in a game like Sekiro, but it doesn't translate well to Elden Ring in my opinion. Part 3, everything else. I didn't know what to do for a third part segment, So let's just talk about everything else in this DLC. Firstly, the world is spectacular. Miyazaki said the size of Limgrave, but the truth is it's the size of Limgrave, Caelid, Weeping Peninsula and Dragon Barrow put together. And just like the main game, everything in it is just spectacular. Apart from the giant scorpions. F those things. The new weapon classes are fantastic. My favourite so far are the Great Katanas, and my favourite specific weapon is the Dragon Hunter's Great Katana, which I used to beat Mesmer. The weapon arts they added in are so cool, and I'm rather intrigued to try out the hand-to-hand arts. And don't worry about not having enough upgrade materials, because the DLC is littered with them, including Ancient Dragon and Somber Ancient Dragon smithing stones. The Legacy dungeons are so fun to go through, even if the enemies have a way too high damage output for how many there are. My favourite so far is Castle Ensis, as it feels like a mix between Stormvale Castle and Raya Lucaria Academy. It has a strong NPC with a colossal sword you can get if you kill it, and the whole area ends with an incredibly tough but fun boss fight. I watched someone talk about Rolana and how it's more of a dance than a fight, and the key is learning about the choreography of the dance. The last time I heard a boss be compared to a dance in these games is Lady Maria, and if you think about it, Rolana is basically what would happen if you mixed Lady Maria, Pontiff Sulyvahn and Renala together. Such a good fight. Speaking of good fights, let's talk about the MVP of the DLC, Mesmer the Impaler. Genuinely my favourite boss fight in the whole game so far, even if he started to annoy me a bit in the end. But that could be blamed on the heat as well. Seriously, it was ludicrously warm when I fought him. To put my experience of this fight into words, he reminds me of the best Dark Souls 3 bosses, where at first you get decimated, but the more you learn, the further you get. I can't remember the total count of attempts it took, but it's definitely the second most in the game, just behind Millenio in 29 tries with summons. The moment I beat him, I immediately used his remembrance to get his spear, and I bought his armour. And on that note, let's talk about the drip, because hot damn, the new armours are something else. The Solitude set, the Rolana set, the Oathkeeper Knight set, the Knight set, the Fire Knight set, the Mesmer set, especially Mesmer's helmet and cape. Elden Blink is real in the DLC. And those were my thoughts so far with the Elden Ring DLC. I think it's definitely worth the £35 I spent on it, and if you're still on the fence about the DLC, I recommend buying it and keeping an open mind. Your skills will be tested, but you'll have fun with it if you just let yourself live in the moment. Hopefully there'll be some patches in the next couple of weeks to fix some of the bugs, and maybe tone down the visuals so we can actually see during the boss fights, but right now it's still amazing. What do you think of the DLC? Let me know in the comments. Also, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Until next time, my friends.